You wake up in the morning, you pour yourself a cup of coffee, and you probably glance at your calendar.
Right.
And when you do that, you probably assume that the biggest threat you face today is um, maybe a frustrating meeting at work or a missed deadline.
Yeah, or just a really bad traffic jam on your commute.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
We tend to view our daily lives and even our own internal struggles through this very sanitized psychological lens.
Oh, for sure.
We treat our stress, our anger, and our anxieties as these horizontal sociological issues.
Mm.
Things to be managed with, better habits, a new app on your phone, or just a shift in mindset.
Right, like life is just a series of puzzles to solve.
Yeah, but then you encounter a text like 1 Peter 5.8,
Mm.
and that sanitized illusion completely shatters. Suddenly you are looking at a landscape that is far more hostile than a difficult morning routine.
It shatters the illusion because the text forces a complete redefinition of reality.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, it tells you that the quiet, mundane Tuesday you are experiencing right now is not a neutral zone. It is an active battlefield.
Mhm.
We like to categorize our problems as entirely horizontal, things
Uh-huh.
happening between humans, things we can fix with enough time and effort. But the source material we are looking at today forces a vertical and spiritual dimension onto the table.
It really does.
It presents the scenario where an invisible ancient predator is actively hunting you.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking, a deep dive into the theological and historical realities that shape our faith. Today, our mission is to examine a stark, urgent reality presented in two incredibly detailed texts.
Yes.
Both of these sources analyze that famous verse, 1 Peter 5.8, which says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour."
It is such a heavy verse.
It is. So we are
Okay.
going to unpack the specific arguments these texts make about that warning. The authors point out that modern culture basically trains people to sleep.
Right, by framing human struggles strictly as issues to be solved through therapy.
Yeah. But these texts present the listener's life as a literal war zone. And, to understand the gravity of Peter's warning, we cannot read it in a vacuum.
No, you really can't.
We have to look at the terrifying historical soil from which it sprang. So if Peter is writing this warning, what is happening outside his window?
That is the key question.
Are we talking about general ancient world hardship, or is it something worse?
We are talking about something significantly worse.
Okay.
The texts place the writing of this letter around AD 62 to 64.
Right, so first century.
Yes. And Peter is writing from what he calls Babylon, which the sources identify as a cryptogram for Rome.
So he is using a code word.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because it was dangerous. He is writing to what he calls elect exiles, who are scattered across Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
And those areas are basically modern-day Turkey, right?
Yeah, the northern and central parts of Asia Minor. And that phrase, elect exiles, is fascinating. The sources argue it joins sovereign grace with social alienation.
What does that look like on the ground?
Well, it means the recipients were chosen by God, but they lived as absolute strangers in a world that fundamentally misunderstood them.
Ah, I see.
And the timing is, well, it is a terribly dark hour. The Roman Empire under Emperor Nero was shifting its posture toward Christianity.
Right, because up until then, the sources explain that Christianity was viewed as sort of a protected Jewish sect by the Roman authorities.
Yeah, it had legal protection under the umbrella of Judaism.
But that was changing. It was becoming recognized as an illegal, uncompromising faith. It disrupted the whole pagan, emperor-worshipping fabric of the Greco-Roman world.
It really did.
So how did that actually play out for a regular person living in that society?
To understand the daily friction, you have to realize that religion in the ancient world was not a private weekend activity.
Right, it wasn't just going to a building on Sunday.
No, not at all. It was tied to literally everything. The meat in the market was sacrificed to idols.
Oh, wow.
The trade guilds, which you had to be part of to make a living, held feasts honoring patron deities.
So if you didn't participate.
Right. To refuse participation in these things was not seen as a personal religious choice. It was seen as treasonous and antisocial.
Because you were rejecting the fabric of their society.
Yes. The believers honored the emperor, but they refused to confess Caesar as Lord. They worshipped Christ alone.
And that brought consequences.
Severe consequences. That refusal of pluralism meant losing your business, being ostracized by your family, and increasingly facing physical violence.
Which brings us to the specific imagery Peter uses.
Right.
Because when he says roaring lion, we might picture A wildlife documentary or maybe a trip to the zoo.
Yeah, we have a very safe view of lions.
But for the people reading this letter in the first century, that phrase had a very different, very terrifying resonance.
Oh, the original audience would have heard that in a visceral, sickening way.
Really?
Yes, they knew about the Roman amphitheaters. They knew that literal lions were captured in Africa, shipped across the empire, kept starved in cages beneath the arena, and then unleashed upon criminals.
That is horrific.
And around this exact time, under Nero, they were beginning to be unleashed upon Christians.
So it wasn't just a metaphor.
No, the roar of the lion in that context was not a metaphor for having a bad day at work. It meant imminent, violent, public death.
Wow.
The authors emphasize that Peter pulls back the curtain here. He is showing these believers that the magistrates who arrest them, the hostile government officials, and the slanderous neighbors who turn them in those are just the visible teeth.
The visible teeth of what?
Of an unseen spiritual architect. Behind the human government, there is a spiritual predator.
That raises a really interesting comparison, I think.
How so?
Well, the early church faced this massive, overt cultural pressure. I mean, the literal threat of violence, the amphitheater, the executioner's sword.
Right.
Today, the modern church often faces a different kind of pressure. It feels more focused on societal assimilation, ideological conformity, or being marginalized from the public square.
Yeah, it's a different landscape.
So my question is the modern church actually facing the same type of threat today, or has the lion changed his tactics?
According to the sources, the goal remains identical, even if the tactics shift based on the era.
Okay, unpack that.
The enemy uses overt violence, like state-sponsored persecution in places where that is possible, but he uses the subtle seduction of cultural assimilation in places where it is not.
Ah, so he adapts.
Yes, the texts warn against a progressive evolutionary worldview that assumes humanity is just moving toward enlightenment and leaving these ancient hostilities behind.
Right, the idea that we've outgrown spiritual warfare.
Yes. According to the authors, human history is a continuous spiritual war. The adversary who utilized the Roman amphitheater also utilizes modern philosophies, media, and progressive ideologies to devour the unwary.
That makes sense.
The roaring lion stalks through subtle compromise, comfort, and distraction just as effectively as he stalks through overt violence.
So we have this invisible, lethal predator prowling around. How do we survive that? The source texts move from the historical threat to the specific instructions Peter gives to his readers.
Right, the grammar of warfare.
Yeah, I want to unpack the mechanism here because the author spent a lot of time on the grammar of this verse. We see two sharp, specific commands right at the beginning. Be sober-minded and be watchful.
In the original Greek, those verbs convey a sense of sharp, decisive urgency.
Like a military command.
Yeah. It is the barking command of a military officer on a battlefield. Let's look at the first command, which translates to be sober-minded.
What is the Greek word there?
The word is naph. Literally, it means to abstain from wine, to be free from intoxication.
But he's not just talking about alcohol here.
No, Peter is using it metaphorically for mental clarity and spiritual composure.
The texts draw a sharp contrast here regarding the culture of the Greco-Roman world. Intoxication was often associated with ecstatic mystery cults and frenzied religious experiences.
Yes, that was very common.
People sought to lose their minds to connect with the divine. It was all about losing control. But Peter is calling for the opposite. He wants a sharp, engaged intellect.
Precisely. And the sources bring this into the modern era, contrasting this mental clarity with contemporary forms of intoxication.
Like what?
Well, we might not be joining ancient mystery cults, but we intoxicate ourselves in other ways with endless entertainment, emotionalism, outrage cycles on social media, or doctrinal novelty.
Oh, that is so true. We are constantly distracted.
The world constantly offers ways to numb your mind or distract your focus. But Peter commands a disciplined, clear mind governed by objective truth.
Because you can't fight if you're stumbling around.
Right. You cannot defend yourself if your senses are dulled.
That mental clarity naturally leads to the second command, to be watchful. I mean, if you are intoxicated, you cannot stay awake.
Right. The word for watchful is gregorasish. It is the military term for a sentry staying awake at his post.
So it implies duty and vigilance.
Yes. And the authors highlight a fascinating historical and theological connection here. This is the very same concept Jesus used in Gethsemane.
When he was in the garden before the crucifixion.
Yes. When he told his disciples to watch and pray lest they enter into temptation.
And Peter was there?
He was. And Peter failed that command. He fell asleep when he should have been standing guard. And as a result, he was entirely unprepared when the soldiers arrived, which led to his denial of Christ.
So he is speaking from very painful personal experience.
Yes. Now, decades later, Peter presses that same desperate necessity upon the church. He learned the cost of sleeping on duty the hard way.
Who exactly are we watching for, though? The text uses specific terms for the enemy, and they are not just generic words for a bad guy.
No, they are highly specific. The first term translates as adversary.
Intoxicating, right?
Yes, this is a legal term. It refers to an opponent in a lawsuit.
A legal opponent.
Yes. The sources reference Zechariah chapter 3, where the enemy stands to accuse the high priest before God.
So he brings charges.
Right. The adversary is a legal opponent bringing objective charges against you based on your sin.
And what is the second term?
The second term is slanderer, or diabolos in Greek.
Which gives us the word diabolical.
Yes. And this traces a consistent biblical portrait. In Genesis 3, the serpent slanders God to humans, suggesting God is holding out on them and cannot be trusted.
Right. Did God really say?
Yeah. And then in Job 1, the adversary slanders humans to God, claiming Job only obeys because he is being bribed with blessings.
So he attacks from both sides.
Yes, this enemy is an accuser and a liar, working constantly to sever the relationship between God and his people.
When Peter describes what this lion wants to do, he uses language that implies absolute finality.
It is terrifying language.
The text notes the enemy is prowling continuously, the word peripate, and roaring to induce panic, which is iriomnos. But the objective is the chilling part.
The devouring part.
Yes, the enemy is seeking someone to devour completely. The Greek word katapein, it's not about taking a bite out of you and walking away.
No, not at all.
It's about swallowing you whole, so there is nothing left. It's the same word used for a grave swallowing a corpse.
The biological reality of a lion's kill is in view here. A predator does not negotiate with its prey, it consumes it.
Right.
Satan does not just want to inflict a minor injury or give you a bad habit. He desires to do to the soul what the grave does to the body. He wants utter consumption.
That makes me think of an analogy.
Go ahead.
The adversary is like a malicious defense attorney in a court of law.
Right.
But this attorney does not just want to win the case and get a favorable verdict.
Right.
He wants to obliterate the defendant's entire existence. He wants to destroy the defendant's marriage, ruin their reputation, strip them of their assets, alienate their children, and drive them into absolute unrecoverable despair.
The goal is total ruin.
Yes, total ruin.
That analogy captures the severity of the Greek phrasing perfectly. The text is designed to strip away any carelessness that treats sin lightly.
Because we do treat it lightly sometimes.
We do. Modern people often think of Satan as a cartoon character in a red suit with a pitchfork.
Right, which makes him seem harmless.
Which makes the biblical reality jarring. The adversary is not an annoyance. He is an ancient intelligence with a lethal objective. And because his intent is absolute destruction, the believer's vigilance must be absolute.
So we have this invisible lethal predator prowling around, but lions don't just attack randomly, do they?
No, they look for weakness.
Right. They look for a specific vulnerability. They smell blood in the water. What is the spiritual equivalent of that? What makes a person a target?
To find the answer, the authors examine the verses immediately preceding the warning.
So backing up a little bit in chapter 5.
Yes. The literary context is essential. In the verses right before the warning about the lion, Peter gives commands to clothe oneself in humility and to cast all anxieties on God.
That is 1 Peter 5.5 through 7.
Yes. And the sources argue that pride and anxiety are intricately linked, and they constitute the greatest vulnerabilities of the human soul.
How are they linked?
Anxiety is described in the text as a form of functional atheism.
Let's unpack that. How is anxiety functional atheism? That sounds like a heavy charge.
When you are consumed by anxiety, you are implicitly denying God's providential care.
Okay.
You are acting as if you have to manage the universe, or at least your corner of it. It is a form of pride that assumes the individual bears the weight of outcomes instead of God.
So by worrying, I'm essentially saying God isn't in control. I am.
Yes. The texts assert that this heavy burden of care, this internal panic, is the scent of blood that attracts the lion.
Wow.
If you are weighed down by the cares of the world, your mind is entirely distracted by your own circumstances.
And if you are distracted, you are not sober-minded.
Well, yes, precisely. And if you are not sober-minded, you are prey.
Wait, I struggle with this concept a bit. Let's push back on this.
Okay, let's hear it.
If someone is facing a devastating reality, a terminal cancer diagnosis, the loss of a child, or complete financial ruin, telling them to just cast your anxiety on God sounds A bit like toxic positivity.
It can sound that way, yes.
Does the text actually expect people to just turn off their fear and ignore the real dangers around them? How do you do that without becoming totally passive or apathetic?
That is a crucial distinction, and the sources address that tension directly. The text does not command casting cares as a form of stoic denial.
So it's not pretending things are fine?
No, it does not ask you to pretend the cancer diagnosis is not terrifying. Instead, it clarifies that you cast your cares specifically so that your mind is clear enough to fight.
Oh, I see.
Freedom from anxiety is the prerequisite for military vigilance. You do not cast your cares on God to take a nap. You cast your cares on God so your hands are free to pick up your sword.
That is a very different picture.
It means naming the heavy burdens in prayer, submitting to providence, and refusing to treat fear as the ultimate authority in your life.
Because the lion is looking for that fear.
Yes. The lion targets the isolated, the proud, and the anxious. You hand over the anxiety so you can hold the line.
That is a huge shift in perspective. Yeah. But even with a clear mind, if the enemy is this lethal and humans are this vulnerable, a listener might naturally fall back into terror.
It is a terrifying reality.
The source texts counter this potential panic by introducing the doctrine of divine providence.
Yes.
They bring up a theological framework where the adversary, despite his strength and malice, is still a created being. There is a phrase quoted in the text, "The devil is God's devil."
That concept is highly rooted in historical theology. The texts insist that Satan is not an autonomous rival deity operating outside the boundaries of God's eternal decree.
So it's not a yin and yang situation.
No, dualism, the idea of a good god and a bad god locked in a cosmic arm wrestling match where the outcome is uncertain, is not biblical.
The adversary is a creature.
He is. He is not omniscient. He does not know your thoughts. He is not omnipotent. He cannot do whatever he wants, and he is not omnipresent. He can only be in one place at a time.
So he is severely limited.
He operates strictly on a divine leash. He can only roar where God permits him to roar, and he can only sift what God allows him to sift, as we see in the book of Job.
Right. In Job chapter 1, Satan has to ask for permission.
Yes. The historical believers facing the amphitheater were meant to view their suffering under the mighty hand of God, knowing nothing happens outside his sovereign will.
But that creates a paradox, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, if believers are completely secure in God's hands and the devil is on a leash, why does Peter give such an urgent, barking command to be watchful?
Ah, I see.
If I am safe, why do I need to be on guard?
The authors explain that God's absolute sovereignty does not cancel out creaturely malice, nor does it cancel out human responsibility.
So they go hand in hand.
Yes. God ordains the end, the preservation of his people, but he also ordains the means to that end. The warning itself, the command to be sober and watchful, is the specific instrument God uses to keep believers from destruction.
God's preservation and human vigilance do not contradict each other.
No, they work together.
I think of it like a parent walking with a toddler near a busy, dangerous highway.
Okay.
The parent has a firm, unbreakable grip on the child's hand. The child is not going to be lost to the traffic, but the parent still shouts, "Watch out for those cars."
Right.
The child hears the urgency in the voice and learns to pay attention. That urgent warning is the specific instrument the parent uses to teach the child awareness and to keep the child safe.
That is a great analogy.
The grip guarantees the safety, but the warning is the mechanism of that safety in the moment.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The fear Peter intends to stir is a filial fear, the reverence of a child trusting a good parent.
Not a paralyzing fear.
No, it is not the servile despair of someone abandoned in the dark to fend for themselves. The believer humbles himself under God's mighty hand, knowing the enemy is terrifying, but also resting in the fact that the enemy is not sovereign.
This theological framework of sovereignty isn't just an abstract idea. It finds its proof in historical reality.
Yes, in history.
The sources move to the specific victory won by the Savior. They detail the vast difference between the counterfeit roaring lion and the true lion of the tribe of Judah.
The Christological contrast is the center of gravity for the texts. Satan is described as being like a roaring lion. He is a predatory imitation.
An imposter.
Yes. But the book of Revelation identifies Christ as the true lion of the tribe of Judah. The texts trace this through redemptive history, contrasting human failure with Christ's perfect vigilance.
Let's look at that contrast. You see Adam's failure in a perfect paradise.
Right. The Garden of Eden.
He had every advantage, yet he listened to the slanderer and plunged humanity into ruin.
He was not watchful.
And we see Peter's own failure in Gethsemane, falling asleep when commanded to watch. But in complete contrast, Christ maintained perfect sobriety in the barren wilderness.
Matthew chapter 4.
Right. He faced the tempter while starving, relying entirely on the written word of God.
And in Gethsemane, while the disciples slept, Christ remained entirely watchful, sweating drops of blood as he anticipated the wrath he would bear.
Christ's perfect obedience is what answers the legal accusations of the adversary, right?
Yes. The texts examine Colossians chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 2, detailing how the cross broke the enemy's teeth.
That is a vivid image.
Through death, Christ destroyed the one who has the authority of death. The legal demands of the law were met. God disarmed the demonic rulers and authorities, putting them to open shame, triumphing over them in the cross.
So the roaring lion is a mortally wounded beast,
Yes.
which naturally leads to another question.
Okay.
If the enemy is already mortally wounded and legally disarmed at the cross, why does he still possess the capacity to devour? Why is he still a threat today if the war is won?
The texts unpack this using the concept of already and not yet eschatology.
The already and not yet.
Yes. The victory is decisively secured at the cross, the debt is canceled, and the enemy is disarmed in the courtroom of heaven.
That is the already.
Right. However, the final execution of the sentence awaits the return of Christ. That is the not yet. We live in the tension between Christ's decisive victory and his public return to consummate his kingdom. During this interim period, the church remains in the wilderness.
So the beast is still thrashing around.
The enemy still prowls, thrashing in his final desperate death throes, seeking to inflict as much damage as possible before his judgment. His roar is loud precisely because he knows his time is short.
Because the enemy is real but defeated, the source material demands specific, daily actions from the reader to survive these ongoing skirmishes.
Right, practical application.
The authors lay out practical applications for the modern believer. First, the expert analysis in the text points out a strong rejection of certain false tactics that people try to use in spiritual warfare.
Yes, the texts explicitly reject charismatic mysticism.
Like what kinds of things?
Like attempting to bind the devil, speaking directly to demons, or claiming territorial authority over cities.
The sources don't support that.
No, the sources describe those practices as unscriptural and dangerously arrogant, noting that even the archangel Michael did not bring a blasphemous judgment against the devil, but said, "The Lord rebuke you."
So we shouldn't be picking fights we aren't equipped for.
Correct. They also reject the opposite extreme.
What is the opposite extreme?
Secular therapeutic models that reduce the concept of sin and spiritual warfare to chemical imbalances or psychological issues to be managed strictly through clinical therapy.
Right, throwing out the spiritual aspect entirely. Now, as we move into how the sources apply this to our current cultural moment, I want to clarify something for you listening. Our goal today is to look at the specific theological and political critiques presented by the authors, unpacking their arguments objectively.
Yes.
We are reporting on how the sources interpret these issues rather than taking a personal side. So the texts we are reading argue that specific modern ideologies are actually contemporary strategies used by the adversary to devour the church.
The author specifically names movements like critical race theory, intersectionality, and the seeker-sensitive church model.
Let's break down the author's logic on that.
According to the logic of the source material, these movements are viewed as tools designed to fracture the unity of the church and replace the biblical gospel.
How does the text say they do that?
For instance, the author argues that ideologies focusing on systemic intersectionality replace the concept of universal human sin with a matrix of perpetual grievance and group identity.
And the author believes this prevents true reconciliation.
Yes, the text argues it creates division instead of unity in Christ. Furthermore, the author contends that a church focusing on pragmatic, seeker-sensitive methods, trying to be relevant and entertaining while avoiding the preaching of sin and judgment, creates a congregation that is entirely asleep.
Going back to the idea of intoxication and slumber.
Yes. They become highly vulnerable to the devouring intent of the adversary because they have laid down their weapons to be comfortable.
By attributing these cultural shifts to the strategy of the prowling lion, the author is urging the reader to reject assimilation.
Right.
Instead of adopting those modern strategies or getting swept up in cultural trends, the text prescribes what it calls the ordinary arsenal.
The ordinary means of grace are the actual weapons prescribed for this spiritual war.
What are those?
People often want flashy, cinematic spiritual experiences, but the texts list things that seem painfully mundane. immersing the mind in objective scriptural truth through reading and preaching,
Right, we were.
participating in the sacraments like communion and baptism, engaging in fervent, dependent prayer, relying on the structure and accountability of the local church.
Yes, the basics of the faith.
Yes. Furthermore, the texts point out the necessity of complementarian household leadership, where fathers and husbands act as vigilant shepherds, actively guarding their homes and children from secular ideologies.
I look at the ordinary means of grace like a daily supply line for a soldier stationed in a trench.
Tell me more about that.
Receiving communion, reading the scriptures every morning, praying with your congregation on a Sunday, these things might lack the visual drama of a movie battle. They seem so ordinary that we often neglect them.
We get bored with them.
Yeah, we do. But those basic rations, that steady supply line, are what actually keep the soldier alive and standing when the bombardment starts.
That is so true.
If you cut the supply line because you are bored or because you want to chase after a novel strategy, you starve on the battlefield. The enemy doesn't even have to fight you. You just collapse from malnutrition.
That is the pastoral burden of the texts right there. A believer who neglects the reading of the word, stops praying, or isolates from the physical gathering of the church is wandering out of a fortress and into the tall grass where the lion waits.
Into the danger zone.
Vigilance is maintained through the disciplined, repetitive use of these ordinary tools, knowing that Christ preserves his sheep through them. You don't need a new strategy. You need to faithfully execute the commands you have already been given.
Synthesizing everything we have unpacked today, the core lesson from these sources is that your life is not a playground.
It is not.
It is a battleground. You are dealing with an adversary who desires your total ruin, who wants to swallow you whole.
But he is a creature.
Yes, he operates on a leash held by a sovereign God who has already secured the final victory through the blood of Christ.
The tension is incredibly real, but the hope is absolute. You're commanded to wake up, stand guard, and think clearly, but you do so resting entirely on the finished work of the Savior who kept watch perfectly on your behalf.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Consider the noise in your own life right now.
There is so much noise.
When you hear the roar of cultural intimidation, when you feel the crushing weight of internal accusation, or when sudden anxiety hits you over your finances or your health, ask yourself, are you reacting to the sheer volume of the noise, or are you resting in the authority of the chief shepherd who holds the leash?
That is the question to ask.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into 1 Peter 5.8. Keep thinking clearly and keep your eyes open. We will catch you on the next one.